Thank you. And yes, we will now move on to the last panel discussion of this session. Now, in the panel discussion in session 1, I have also mentioned electricity security, and yes, that is also part of the theme. But now in this session, we will also talk about the supply chain. So we will, because we have just heard from the speakers discussing the supply chain more in depth. So now we will hear from the panelists about their thoughts. And then also, now Managing Director Yusu Lee earlier complained about having to be the last panelist. So I now give you the chance to be the first. Yes, thank you. This is Yusu Lee from the Korea Energy Economics Institute. Yes, I did mention that, and now I get an immediate reaction. So thank you. And now I also hope that our power system or energy system, if we have issues, then how nice would it be if we could also have immediate reaction? So that was just my wishful thinking. And now between session 1 and 2, perhaps there may be some redundancy in the discussions, but I do believe that session 2 is a more comprehensive in concept. So regarding the energy security, or also the Europe triggered energy crisis, and also the energy security. So I see that we are also talking about the electricity security as part of the larger concept of energy security. At any rate, we have heard from 3 speakers. So first, Professor Michael Beer talked about the 2050 net zero and the various approaches or the tools that would enable us to get there, and then also what will transpire afterwards. And also in the case of Korea, so he talked about the benefits too. So in the case of Korea, I mean, we always talk about the cost, how expensive it is going to be to reach net zero by 2050. Of course, cost is an important aspect, but what we are aiming for is not just about the cost, but also the benefits, because we have the hope or we have the expectation that the benefits are going to outweigh the cost. So for those benefits later on, despite the cost, we will still march forward in this path. So that would be the selling point, I would say. So for that, I thank Professor Breer for giving us a very good intuition. And then Professor Chung-Bae Park, he talked about the various crises in and outside of Korea, and also he talked about their impact on the Korean market. Now, in terms of the fuel or the energy mix diversification, Professor Park mentioned that Korea is faring better. So when we take a deeper dive into this, then we appear to have adequate diversity in the energy mix. But perhaps, structurally speaking, maybe that is so. But then, 93% of fuel being imported from outside of Korea, this I would say is highly significant. And also the potential electricity shortage. Anyway, so I believe that that could have a very big impact. And then also Professor Kim added this comment, which is, of course, this was in comparison to other countries. So perhaps on the appearance, it appears to be better in Korea, but also on the tariff side, because they cannot fully reflect the cost. We now have losses from the Korea Electricity and Power Corporation. So in terms of the power supply, whether we can secure stability. So regarding this question, I also agree with Professor Kim's view. So let's say when we have a certain system, then we have to think about whether it is sustainable or not. And if the status quo were to be sustained, then no matter the mix, no matter the diversity, then I would say that we are not in a sustainable situation. So I tend to be a bit more pessimistic. So we need to change our system, especially on the tariff side. I see that there are some push to change the tariff, but it appears to be a far-fetched goal. So on one hand, we need to adjust the tariff while realigning the system as well. And also, from a regulated system, I believe it is important to normalize the market functions. So just by regulating the market, it appears as if things are going well from the outside, but when you take a look in the inside, then there are a lot of issues boiling over. So unlike in the past, when the government would try to control everything, regulate everything, so this type of operational system, how sustainable this is going to be. So I believe that we really have to think about this long and hard. And also there are a lot of players, a lot of operators going into the market. Then in terms of the management among the operators and also the conflicts between the operators, they will also become more and more significant. And I believe that the principle should be to leave them to the market, because the market would also come up with the price signals, and then it is based on such price signals that the market participants would produce at an adequate level and sell at an appropriate price. And of course, Professor Park mentioned he also came up with other points, but for example, the marginal pricing, so whether this is valid or not, and then also market that is segregated by the energy source. But now, because we have the bidding in a variable price market, but then if we are to have more of a fixed cost, then perhaps the operators will be able to better plan. And then also segregating by the energy source. Well, when we were coming up with the power market, we also wanted to stoke competition not only between the sources but also within the source. But perhaps this is an issue that is specific to Korea, but then the cost by source is so large. So that is why they also had to adjust the adjustment coefficient and so forth. So I believe that the adjustment or the competition among the sources is not even made possible. So let's say if we are to have a VC for example, the nuclear power plant and so forth, then it appears as if they will be similar to a segregated market. And I also understand that there is some planning underway in that direction. So in conclusion, unless we normalize the market, then in the wholesale market, so we could try to come up with the generation mix or more energy diversity, but I believe that they will all be for naught unless we normalize the market. So the priority should be to normalize the market, and then the tariff should also be able to better reflect the involved cost so that we can send the right price signals to the market participants. That is all. Thank you. Okay, thank you. And then I move on to Professor Yu.
네, 같은
So thank you very much. I would like to thank the three presenters for great presentations. First, the Professor Michael Blair, while listening to your presentation, I really envied Australia, especially CCUS has been actively utilized, and also you talked about the 2,000 gigawatts for the capacity for the renewable energy. I was shocked by that high number. And in that aspect, Korea has imported the large amount of coal and LNG from Australia. And in the future, I think that the green hydrogen and ammonia are likely to be imported from Australia as well. And some companies in Korea, the carbon dioxide captured in Korea using the Australia's abandoned gas reserve. They are planning to store them in Australia. So in terms of net zero, I believe that the Korea and the Australia have a lot for cooperation. So what kind of areas we can cooperate? That's my question to Professor Michael Blair. So what are the areas where Korea and the Australia can cooperate for net zero? And Professor Park talked about the energy security crisis, and LNG crisis is the core element, and I completely agree with this. So securing the stable supply of energy is very important for us to overcome this current energy crisis. But at the same time, I think we have to have a more flexible system to introduce the LNG in the future. In other words, maybe we can have a flexible mechanism such as cargo swap or terminal swap. So we can have diverse kinds of the swap methods to be implemented in Korea. And for this, we should have a more flexible mechanism for the utilization of Coex facilities. And also we need more open access guaranteed for network so that the operators, once they have the LNG, they should be able to utilize them where they are needed. And also through the fair and free competition, the LNG, once introduced, they should be able to be resold. Reselling should be made possible. Only then, I believe, various players will introduce the LNG to Korea and use them for power generation to enhance electricity supply security. And the second thing that I would like to talk about is, as mentioned by Professor Kim Jin-soo in early session. So the first and the second oil crisis led to the 3 to 4 times increase in oil price. But this time, what we experienced is that the oil price increased by 5 times, and coal by 8 times, and the natural gas by 35 times. In other words, it's much more severe energy crisis compared to the oil crisis in the 1970s. And I think we have to understand why such massive crisis occurred. Apparently, you may think that the Russo-Ukraine war was the main culprit, but in fact, I think we actually saw some signs from last year or the year before last year. The U.S. California experienced the blackout, Texas experienced the blackout, and also last year there was a lack of power generation from offshore wind in the UK. And this is because we have overlooked the importance of making investment in fossil fuel facilities, and we tended to focus on renewables only. So then we experienced the supply disruptions. And so we were in a hurry to introduce the fossil fuel. So the price of the fossil fuel went up. And also the cobalt, lithium, as well as the coal, these basic commodities prices went up. So we experienced the green inflation, which is caused by expensive renewable energy. At the same time, the demand for various equipment and resources for renewable power generation went up significantly, and this has led to the so-called double inflation. And then it got aggravated by the Russo-Ukraine war. That's why we are now experiencing the current energy crisis. So this is something that we have to be clear about. And in this regard, so it's mentioned by the Professor Park, we have to come up with the diverse strategies rather than trying to have one single strategy because nothing can become a silver bullet. So we have to have a stable supply of fossil fuel, and also We have to have the sufficient facilities for backup reserve while pursuing the expansion of the renewable energy. Only then I believe that Korea will be able to secure stable electricity supply. In other words, in order to have the firm power, we have to build a comprehensive and diverse portfolio rather than focusing too much on a single sector. Thank you very much.
코멘트 감사드립니다. 그럼 조 교수.
Thank you very much for the detailed explanation. And now let me hand over to Professor Cho. Now, I have used up quite a lot of time earlier, so I would now use my stopwatch to limit myself to 5 minutes. Now, first of all, Professor Breer, I would like to thank you very much for the outstanding presentation. And especially compared to Korea, then renewable energy, whether there can be more or not, and also to include that in the scenario analysis, that was highly impressive. And given that I'm not familiar with the Australian situation, I'd just like to raise two questions. Now, from the papers, I see that now in Australia there was a change in the political situation, and I understand that the national reduction goal was upwardly adjusted by 2030. So the CO2 is about 600 million tons in Australia, and by 2030, so whether this is doable or not, I wonder what the opinion is inside Australia. And then the second question, this was also mentioned earlier, but now for Australia, the gas and coal. So Korea is also a big importer of these resources. But I understand that there's also quite a lot of environmental issues over the gas field development in Australia. So if the gas field development does not go well, then this would also have a direct impact on Korea as well. Of course, countries have different circumstances. Australia has other alternative sources, but then for the case of Korea, then now Korea, we are trying to go from coal to gas in order to reduce CO2. Now then Australia, now if you are to do this, then your effort for CO2 reduction might not really bode well for the CO2 reduction in Korea. So I'm just wondering about the development of the gas field. So what is the current situation about the gas field development in Australia? And now let me move on to Professor Park with two questions again. So yes, I understand that natural gas is an important point. So now, of course, Professor Yu just mentioned this too, but if I may add a bit more, so yes, about the flexibility or the diversity about the natural gas or the generation mix, so good point. And just one thing, and that is about the direct buyer's obligation. So for example, you set aside the reserve, and then perhaps we can also allow the direct procurement. By doing so, we can also enhance the security or the stability. And so what would be your feedback regarding this? And then also regarding the mix, yes, I also agree that we need to have the right balance and we need to have greater diversity. And now I also changed the term to rainbow mix. So yes, I believe that we need to have the balance here. And another thing, now this is related to the discussion in the earlier session, and that is about the marginal pricing and whether this is valid or not. And yes, of course, Professor Park explained this well, but I also agree, yes. Yes, in the past, the marginal pricing, there were a lot of benefits to be gained. So, for example, if there was more demand, then they could also install more capacity. So it also had the mechanism of increasing capacity, but then I don't think that really worked in Korea because the capacity installation was determined by the government. And for some time, there were the signals from the market, but still, they were not really reflected by the follow-up actions. So I believe that the only thing remaining is that now the fixed costs or the variable costs, so they will be determined before we install the capacity, and then perhaps they just utilized the SMP. They applied the SMP after the capacity was installation in order to minimize the price variability. Because capacity installation, this is sunken cost, and then just determining the SMP, so determining the pricing utilizing SMP was probably the way to minimize the cost. But again, I do not believe that this is sustainable, but for the time being, and this is on an extension of what I said earlier, but now, even for one principle, let us do this right. So that is why I am mentioning this. I'm not saying that we have to carry this on until the end, but at least until we have gas and coal, then in order to minimize the fuel costs, I believe that for the time being, we probably have to maintain marginal pricing. And also related to this, quantum jump, I also agree that we need this, meaning that we need to have fundamental changes. But then perhaps I am more myopic, but for this to be possible, then there are a number of requirements. I was talking about path dependency earlier. We cannot just move from this path to another path. So we need to have the governance. We need to have the drivers who would push through with this. So then who can create the big picture? But I don't believe we have that governance at this time, and perhaps that is why we would depend on this current path. And just one last two comments. Then what Professor Park has mentioned, so CNFA, NA, and others, we can all turn them into indices. So capacity or whatever, so we can like increase them by like 0.1. But I think the most challenging would be network availability. So can we create an index for this? I'm not sure whether we can. And related to that, second, again, this is related to the index. Perhaps this is a minor point, but there is a difference between indicator and index. So I agree with Professor Kim. So when we create an index, I think we need to use both, because index is utilizing indicators by giving them weight in order to turn them into one index. So if you have one index, then it's good for comparison. But then the index could differ depending on how much weight we give to indicators. And so whenever we came up with this kind of index, then this always become a problem in terms of the weight for the indicator. So whichever index we come up with, we also have to give painful consideration for this. Otherwise, the index itself would become problematic. So that is all. And I went 1 minute over time. Thank you.
말씀하신 인디케이터하고
Thank you very much. So regarding the indicator index, I think this is something that I also agree a lot. And I think we really have to pay attention to these issues. So we have had the 3 presentations, and we also there are several questions that went to Professor Michael Breyer. So we would like to hear the answer from Professor Michael Breyer. Can you answer this question, Professor?
Yes, certainly. And I thank my colleagues for those questions and for the honour of speaking today. Before I answer those questions, I would also like to emphasise that my talk does not for 1 minute diminish the significance of the current energy crisis. And this crisis has impacted all of us very significantly, Australia included. Our national electricity market in May was suspended for several weeks because of these extraordinarily high gas prices and non-availability of coal, even in this very energy resource rich nation. So I appreciate the study I'm talking about today is very different in content to my colleagues' talks, but I have a tremendous amount of respect for and appreciate the importance of those talks. In answering some of these questions about can Australia and Korea cooperate, I would of course first note that Korea is a very, very important trading partner to Australia and of course a very good friend. Many Korean and Australian companies already work very closely together and we know each other very well. In fact, it is hard for me to see if there are any parts of the energy system where we could not work together. Korea, as you know, is a very large energy importer, but also has many wonderful manufacturers of energy and transport technology. Australia has very established large companies that are excellent integrators of those technologies. So we can do lots of work together. if we think about this in several ways, we can see, for example, that large investment by Korean finance in Australian assets will probably be required. Many of those assets could be made in Korea. Also, the number of workers that we will need to build these assets may require, for example, us to think very creatively about whether we need assistance from Korea to build these assets. And most importantly, for a university professor, is student exchange between the two countries to help us build these things together, in my view, needs to be greatly expanded. But I do recognise that that could be self-interested thinking. The second question was regarding the 2030 target in Australia that has now been made law recently. That is a very good question as to whether or not it's achievable, and I would prefer not to comment on whether or not it is achievable. I would prefer rather to give numbers and let other people make up their own minds. From this study, we think that that 2030 target would require at least a factor of 6 growth in current renewable capacity, as well as many other measures on the demand side and network and other investments. That is clearly a very large undertaking, but it is an undertaking which, of course, is hopefully in the long-term global interest and also in Australia's long-term economic interest. Importantly, the question about Australia's development of its natural gas resources is, of course, a very, very important question for Korean customers. In our modelling, we're not seeing LNG export stopping for quite some time yet. Indeed, there are cases where we could see LNG exports going up depending on the balance of global demand, or going down. But the development of Australian LNG resources is, of course, a very important thing for our export partners, of which Korea is one of our most important. And we fully appreciate that the prospects of your own decarbonisation and energy security needs are reliant on the performance of the Australian natural gas industry. Thank you.
네, 답변해 주셔서 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for the response. And now, moving back to the Korean speakers, now I would like to go back to you to listen to your responses. Professor Park first. Thank you. Within 5 minutes. So then within 5 minutes, I shall make 3 points. The first, Professor Michael's scenario. Now looking at the 6 scenarios, and so analysis with 6 scenarios, that was highly impressive. So I see that the technological portfolio is quite broad. Now in our case, our net zero scenario, we only used 2 scenarios and the portfolio was not that broad, and also the NDC. So in our case, we were just looking at one target, so that is one difference between Korea and Australia. And then now, between Mr. Lee and Professor Cho, what they have commonly raised, and that was about normalizing the tariff and the market, I fully agree, 100%. But then now in Korea, for KEPCO, there's like a 30% loss, and now if we are to normalize them, then it would be like a 5% of the GDP. But now if for this shock, now what if it were like the situation in Europe, if it had been like going to 40% to GDP, then what would have happened in Korea? So I wasn't making the point that we should not go back to, we should not normalize. So I just wanted to make that clear that my point was not to, just maintain it as it is. But I do fully agree that we need to normalize the market as well as the tariff. Then also about the gas network neutrality. Yes, I also agree that that is very important to secure the gas network neutrality. So I thought that this would be in Professor Kim's presentation, so I skipped this. But then now I think it was at G7 or G20, but then one of the items, so they were talking about energy security, and the surest way was to mobilize resources from the market. So for that point, again, I would like to emphasize that I do not differ at all. And for the marginal pricing, that was just to throw around, just a question for us to throw around, because I believe that it is time for us to think about. And then since then, because for the coal input, I mean, that was at the sixth basic plan, and since then, no more coal input. Then if we can no longer consider this for the longer term and just having this marginal pricing or the marginal cost to determine the price, then it seems as if the gap between reality and marginal pricing is becoming bigger. So I was just hoping that we could consider this question a bit more. That is all. Thank you.
직접적으로 여쭤보신 내용은 없었.
Professor Kim, I didn't have the questions. I will just make some comments. According to the recent statistics on the energy consumption, Korea ranks 8th in the world. And so in terms of energy, next year, I think Korea will join the club of G7 because the Germany is much higher than Korea. It now saves a lot of energy. So maybe soon Korea will outpace Germany in terms of energy consumption and join the club of G7. So this shows that the Korea is a large consumer of energy. But we haven't really put a lot of thought on energy security. Oil is something that can be storable, and the gas is also something that can be stored. So we have had some storages, but for electricity, it's a different issue. And so far, we have just tried to have sufficient infrastructures in order to prevent any kind of outages and blackout. And so far, the system worked well, but I believe that it will no longer be safe enough for the future. So rather than later, sooner, I think we have to redefine our thinking and take some innovative approaches to guarantee energy security or electricity security. And
없습니다. 한국은 상류 부분 EMP 포함해서
we have as for the windfall tax, Korea has no operators where we can impose windfall tax, so it's not really a viable solution. And as mentioned by Professor Breer, so they developed the 6 scenarios for the analysis, and the UK case that I cited, they also developed the 7 scenarios to project the path toward the carbon neutrality. And so these scenarios are not just the positive. Sometimes there are also scenarios for worst case, and also if there is not enough technological innovation, if they have to continue to use the conventional resources, all of them are reflected in scenarios. So when making policies, I believe that we have to develop this kind of scenario to guide our decision-making process. And also for the electricity security, I believe that rather than just focusing on short-term matters, we have to have some long-term perspective. And also for contingency and emergency plan, yes, this is something we need, but at the same time, we also have to have a long-term response because the energy security has the 2 important elements, which is the flexibility and the diversification. And these are something that we can not achieve over time. So we have to develop some strategies for this long-term security. And the UK, after the Ukraine war, this spring, they came up with a new energy security report and new strategies for energy security. And if you read that report, because of the Russo-Ukraine war, they made it very clear that they were not going to import any resources from Russia. And also their strategy include the utilization of oil and gas, although they are very strong with regards to net zero. And what's most impressive is that they have diverse kinds of responses, and all of them talk about finance. In other words, how to secure the fund or how to attract investment. But Korea, I think we take a little bit different approach that we only try to minimize the cost, but this is not effective. So in order to secure energy security, we must have the plans for investment. And the scope of investment is not just the hundreds of millions of won, rather we have to think about like trillions of won range. So we have to take the investment plan into our consideration when planning for energy security. Thank you very much for the response. Last January, I visited Japan and had some conversation with the Japanese colleagues. And S&P increased by 25 times in 3 months in Japan at the time, but Korea experienced none of the price hike. So I said that the Korea is very stable. So how come such dramatic change occurred in Japan? But then this year we experienced a lot of disruptions, and Korea is almost same as Japan. So we are also experiencing a lot of dramatic changes. And Korea, as you know, we are highly reliant on the import of the energy, so we have to have effective responses for demand side. But again, there are not many strategies available for us to use. So although we have heard a lot of opinions and also perspectives, still I think Korea has a very important task to do. So I do have some mixed feelings here. Professor Kim has to leave because he has a class. So we may have to conclude our conference soon. But before that, we actually have several questions that we received earlier. And I think that these questions are something that had to be answered by KPX. So the question is, as for the SOC or mobile infrastructure, using them, how can we strike the balance between the supply and demand? Or how can we ensure the adequate supply? So these are the questions that are collected. And I believe the KPX will answer the question. And with that, we would like to conclude the panel discussion session here. Thank you very much.
네. 네. 그럼 왜 하시죠?
잘 들었습니다. 그런데 좀 답답한 것이 제가 이 에너지
Well, thank you very much. And actually, a bit frustrating for me is that I have been coming here for about 10 years now, so I have seen most of you here. And I would say that there was a simple solution to all of this, and that has been available since 13 years ago. But I keep recommending, I keep proposing, and nobody's interested. You are all experts, and you think you know best. So like this, we cannot have any breakthrough. So you're talking about quantum jump. We have the enabler for quantum jump, but nobody's interested. So I was so frustrated. I invested into this on my own, and we are now coming up with a demo product. And within the year, the demonstration is going to be completed. And by the end of the year, I believe that this technology could also be transferred to Australia as well. And that is about the power generation facility utilizing gravity. So they thought that this was impossible in the past, but now it is possible. And so all those who are involved, we all know this, but then nobody would believe us. So I invested my own money into this, and we are at the last stage of development. Demonstration will be completed by the end of the year, and then we would be utilizing gravity. We don't have to worry about it anymore. And of course, the output variability, we don't have to worry about it. Nuclear power plant, no worries anymore. And also the installation cost would be like 100 of the wind power or the thermal. And also utilizing gravity, so we do not have to transmit the power long term. So we don't need the transmission lines anymore. So the cost is going to be very, very small. So we don't have to worry about it anymore. So you will be able to see this by the end of the year. Well, I'm not a technological expert, so I'm not in the position to comment on this. But since you mentioned that the demonstration will be completed soon, so I do hope that everyone will be able to see this when it is done. So thank you very much for your input. And with that, we will conclude the panel discussion at this time.